I'm Mike Pettit. I am a professor of psychology at York University in Toronto. I was originally trained as a historian of science and medicine, but I'm part of York. At York in Psychology, we have a program dedicated to the historical, theoretical, and critical studies of psychology, of which I'm a part. This week at the conference, I'll be presenting a chapter from a current book project I'm working on. The chapter that I'm thinking about this week is a history of the Black psychology movement in the United States and its links to anti-colonial theories and movements, and in particular around issues of incarceration. And this is part of a larger book project which looks at the recent history of psychology in the United States since the 1970s. So I think culture is a very interesting and contested keyword for both historians and psychologists. In psychology, we talk about cultural psychology, cross-cultural psychology, and transcultural psychology. So thinking exactly what is the work of the cultural and the universal is I think an important one. As someone who largely focuses on North American psychology, I'm very much interested in what we say as provincializing that kind of global universal psychology and thinking about its local historical embeddingness. Yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting work on the program in kind of altering our dominant geographies of psychology and psychiatry in the second half of the 20th century. I'm really excited about that kind of work. Moving beyond certain canonical figures and kind of thinking about them in isolation and thinking in new contexts. And I think we're going to have some interesting conversations around what does it mean to kind of do this kind of work from below and above. So for me, I think doing, most broadly speaking, kind of historical and anthropological work on psychology and psychiatry. I, as I said, mentioned largely work in a psychological context. And so for us, teaching the history of psychology in a critical manner, I think, is an important pedagogical thing for psychologists in training. It helps them reflect on their practice and hopefully helps in culture a sense of kind of epistemic humility as they approach their clinical and experimental work. Right now in psychology and history, there's a lot of concerns around race and racism. And the inspiration for this project was not so much to look for race in psychology, but to look at how psychology got represented in Black media in North America. So the stories I kind of want to tell this week are largely the ways in which the psychology profession was represented in a variety of Black media, popular magazines like Ebony, and more radical newspapers like the Black Panther, as well as the Nation of Islam's Mohammed Speaks. So rather than kind of look for Black people in psychological discourse, I'm interested these days in thinking about the ways in which psychology gets represented in Black discourse of variety of forms. I think so. I think one of the things that kind of really surprised me is actually how prominent psychology is in these underground newspapers and kind of even glossy magazines of the 1970s. And so, yeah, there's much like you would find in other popular magazines of the time period, magazines like Ebony during the 1970s almost always has an article about psychology. And I think tells us a very different kind of story than we've been telling about, for example, popular psychology.